I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week, we're going to be looking at the 2004 Oscars and examining Finding Neverland and its place in Oscar history. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I think has been forgotten to time. One that hasn't been as well appreciated, one that just doesn't necessarily have a cult following or high critical appraisal, yet at the time was considered one of the 10 or 5 best movies of the year. So I want to go back, oftentimes watching these movies for the first time, and trying to understand. Essentially, the show is broken down into 3 parts. The first part just being that historical context, trying to understand where we were at the time, why I chose this movie over some others. Then transition more into my thoughts on the movie, what I thought of it. Like I said, most of the time I'm watching it for the first time. So does it hold up? What are the aspects I like about it or don't? Should it have been nominated for Best Picture that year? And then finally, the third segment is just trying to answer that age-old question as to why this movie was forgotten, why this movie and not another one like Million Dollar Baby has a little bit less of a reputation within sort of modern day critical culture. And speaking of Million Dollar Baby, this was the year of Million Dollar Baby. The year before this was the Lord of the Rings year, which I'll talk about next week. And actually with this year, a lot of these Oscars for this sort of early to mid 2000s, many of them are available on YouTube, the full Oscar show. So I was actually able to go back and watch the full Oscar show, which was really great and insightful, really to tell us, where the culture was at the time, and jokes about the Americans were about to go into the Iraq War. Sort of George Bush jokes. Chris Rock hosted, which I thought he did a really good job with. Of course, he comes back later, I think in like 2016 to host. But that was sort of the moment I think they were in, which is why maybe looking back on it, Million Dollar Baby, which is not the sort of conventional happy ending kind of a movie, does actually win Best Picture. However, this is very much, you were in the middle of the 2000s. This definitely feels like a 2000s kind of an Oscar year. However, I was actually really surprised to see how many of these 5 nominees that were nominated for Best Picture actually tell us a lot about how little has actually changed within the Academy. How these 5 movies are very emblematic of the types of movies that ultimately get nominated every year and maybe have always gotten nominated. These sort of recurring stories that people connect to. But I think particularly this year I found to be a great microcosm as to predictive of what the next really decade would be. So we have Million Dollar Baby, which feels like the sort of important, serious drama, which I sort of compare to something like a Spotlight or an Argo. We have The Aviator, which is the sort of big historical biopic epic from a known auteur. I mean, of course, the direct link there is The Irishman, but I would also argue something like Darkest Hour, even Dunkirk can fall into that category. Then we have Ray, which is in many ways the birth of the biopic. Ray, along with Walk the Line, really showed many members of the Academy that they liked biopics and that this formula works. So I mean, you can draw a direct line between Ray and something like Bohemian Rhapsody, and then even something like Sideways, which feels like this sort of independent movie from an upcoming auteur who everyone really likes, but don't want to give it to their sort of first couple movies, even though Alexander Payne had an election before this, and Citizen Ruth before that. And I think you can draw a line between a movie like Sideways and Call Me By Your Name or Lady Bird, sort of younger filmmakers with the first couple of movies kind of emerging onto the scene, getting that Best Picture nomination, but not necessarily getting the win. And then, of course, the 5th one being Finding Neverland, which I think holds the spot of the sort of heartwarming period piece, historical period piece that's sentimental but makes you feel really good. And I think you can draw a direct line to something like Green Book or Jojo Rabbit. Those 2 movies come to mind. So in many ways, I think the historical context of this year is just to remember that the Oscars actually haven't changed that much. And I think this is actually a good year in terms of that most of these movies have been sort of well remembered and well regarded, and they have movie stars connected to them, or they have sort of well respected directors and Clint Eastwood and Martin Scorsese. But ultimately, I went with Finding Neverland because Million Dollar Baby has Clint Eastwood won Best Picture, has lower prestige. I think is still the reputation still holds up today. Aviator, of course, is Martin Scorsese's film, and therefore will always be sort of well regarded. And it starts the real collaboration of him and Leonardo DiCaprio, which becomes a fruitful relationship. Sideways is also tied to an auteur, Alexander Payne, who still think is very well respected and has done very well with the Oscars, like The Descendants and Nebraska and whatnot. And then Ray is emblematic of the biopic, which is still important as it was so many years ago. I mean, Judas and the Black Messiah was just nominated last year, so we get these movies about historical figures more often than not. And I think Ray feels almost prescient in that way, so less forgotten because it's always referred back to. However, Finding Neverland is kind of in this in-between zone, in the sense that the director is Marc Forster, who I think is maybe the most criminally underrated and underappreciated and maybe wrongfully maligned director of the decade. He's not someone I don't think has a passionate fan base. However, I would consider the sole member of that cult in many ways, because I do really appreciate his movies and like his movies, even the ones that are sort of less well respected. I think World War Z is an incredible thriller. I think Christopher Robin is a really sweet, heartwarming film similar to this. I think Stay is kind of an underrated masterpiece in many ways, which was his follow-up to this movie. But the truth is, there's not a lot of fans. He is sort of seen as a Hollywood hand for hire, and is attached to a lot of projects at many times, and doesn't necessarily have maybe a distinct visual style, although I think he's great at servicing his stories. So the movie doesn't have a signature director. I also think that it's kind of been lost within the Peter Pan-ness of everything. We, of course, had the original Peter Pan animated movie, and then in '91 we had Hook, and then soon after that, 2003, we had Peter Pan, and then this next year, 2004, we have Finding Neverland, and then in 2015 we have Pan, and then David Lowery's making his own Peter Pan movie, and we had Come Away last year, which is partly inspired by Peter Pan. So there's just so many Peter Pan properties that this kind of gets lost in the shuffle. And if this was the only Peter Pan movie, I think people would recognize it as that, but it really isn't. It is in so many reincarnations of this story, so this is just sort of one element of it, and because of that, I think kind of gets lost in the shuffle. But I actually don't think it should get lost in the shuffle. I think this is one of the best Peter Pan kind of adaptations, and in many ways the movie is good because of its connection to Peter Pan. So now, transitioning to my thoughts, what I mean in terms of that is just that the movie is in one part about, writer, inspiration, and the creative process, but in many ways it is a Peter Pan movie. So if you don't know, this is about author J.M. Barrie during his process of writing Peter Pan, through his sort of inspiration and relationships he's developed with the Davies family, both Sylvia Davies and the Davies boys. And it's really just his time with this family that develops a lot of the themes, and we see sort of inspiration and how he sort of translates that from, of course, the actual real life events to the fantasy of it all, and sort of the themes that he believes in, that ultimately injects it himself into the play. And I think the movie captures that sort of idea and those themes of Peter Pan through this movie about the telling of how the Peter Pan story was created. The themes of course, imagination, of never growing up, and how and the sort of interesting connection between how the author's sort of own personal opinions, of course, gets ultimately injected into what he wants to say with the play. And when I think about the movie, I think that's a really heartwarming, nice, kind of sweet, kind of innocent movie in many ways. And nice in many regards can be seen as pejorative. Oh, it's a nice movie, but this is nice in the same way that Paddington is nice. That it's so committed to, I think, earnestness and innocence, despite sort of the potential rumors or unsureness about J.M. Barrie's intentions with the boys. This movie tends to take the perspective that he really, in a sort of a Mr. Rogers-esque way, really cares about this family and the powers of being a kid. And the movie is really infectious at that. I mean, the first Peter Pan works because it sort of gets those themes, but this movie does a great job at sort of blending the real elements of the inspiration with the sort of fun, bringing the play back into play, and having this sort of grand, sweeping, emotionally manipulative at times story that ultimately does work. So, we talked about this idea of sentimentality in the Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close episode, what that kind of means, if it was good or bad. And there I feel like the sentimentality didn't work. However, sentimentality I don't think is a bad thing. I think it can be a very good thing. And when it does work, it's kind of towing this line where, yes, some of the dialogue can be trite or unrealistic. However, if you're so emotionally engaged and invested within your characters, you don't really care. And as a matter of fact, it works even more because you're so emotionally engaged that you really get swept up by the conclusion of this movie. And for me, this was a movie that I actually had seen before, so it was my second time rewatching it, and on the rewatch, it was just as emotionally rewarding as the first. I was, very emotional by the end. I felt the sort of whole story and the characters that you connect to really relatable and sort of by the sort of innocence and the connection that he has with the boys, but also with Sylvia now in his part, sort of like a romance story, but it really is a romance with the family, that he's falling in love with the family and getting so much creative inspiration. And when he gets so much of that creative inspiration and juice and love, and then, you know, eventually pays that off with the final climax of the movie, it feels incredibly rewarding in the same way something like Ed Wood in a way kind of feels rewarding because of that spirit of Ed Wood. And similarly here, because of J.M. Barrie's spirit, he really propels the film along, and many of that has to be attested to Johnny Depp's performance. But you connect to these characters because of the relationships that are built throughout the movie, that it's not just sort of fun 90 minutes all the way through, that there is, you know, of course, some hardship, there is sort of some back and forth, but in these sort of small, simple, but really magnetic, I think, dialogue sequences is where it shines. In many ways, we always see movies where it's the kids teaching the older, stuffy adults about imagination and learning. But in this way, it's kind of unique because it's the opposite. It's the adult teaching the kid how to be a little bit more imaginative and appreciate life. And those sort of small kind of dialogue scenes, the way we see Johnny Depp's character, J.M. Barrie, he sort of processes things before he actually tells it to Peter to try to communicate it in a way that's really simple and effective. Now, what he's doing is communicating that to Peter, kind of how to live your life and things like that, and life lessons. What he's also doing that is making it really simple and easy for the viewer to understand his point of view and to become emotionally invested within his relationship with the family. So by the end of it, you really do believe that he really loves this family. He really feels a connection with these boys, even though he's not their father. And the technical craft is so terrific. This has a real soft, almost nostalgic cinematography. The score is sweeping grand, which, as I said, adds this sort of emotional sentimentality, but that ultimately works. That, you know, you could say it's a sentimental movie, but if you're crying by the end of it, I mean, it works on you, and you feel sort of emotionally rewarded in that sense. So really a sentimental movie, a nice movie, a sweet movie, but a really heartwarming movie that I think, you know, aims to achieve exactly what it does and does that, which may be a reason why it's forgotten. So now talking about that, why the movie's been forgotten, like I mentioned before, I think that it's kind of gotten lost with all the Peter Pan properties. I think Marc Forster's not as well sort of celebrated auteur that allows you to go back through their filmography. I think Johnny Depp and Kate Winslet are both terrific in this movie. However, it's not their best performance, so it's not like you have to see this Johnny Depp movie or Kate Winslet movie. You see other stuff from both of them before you see this. And then I also think that what I just talked about, which is that it's a sweet, heartwarming movie that does what it sets out to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean you want to rewatch it. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to think about it all the time. Like, it's this complex mystery box, which allows for you think like rewatches to be a little bit easier and more rewarding. This movie can very much be sort of a one and a done kind of a movie, which in many ways these types of movies are forgotten because they're not rewatched, because they're not analyzed, because they do so well what they intend to do that they don't feel important. And I mean, importance is a big thing with the Academy. We see something like Crash is a movie that won, we talked about last week, because it felt important. In the same way $1 Million Baby feels dramatic and serious, where Finding Neverland is like really heartwarming and sweet, and it's a true story, and I'm glad I went to the theaters, and I'm glad I watched it, but it's almost sort of excellence, its quiet excellence almost gets sort of overlooked because of that, and I think that's a shame because of how well constructed this is in terms of its real strong technical craft, whether the score, the production design, the design. I was never questioning once whether this was, you know, in real life. It feels like you're transported back into that time, and the story is so well told, and the sort of simplistic but really effective dialogue is great, and the performances, I mean, Freddie Highmore is a really great kid actor in this movie, and that's hard to find, so, you know, having a success like that really helps the movie. So it's a shame that it has been forgotten. I hope it hasn't been too forgotten, that it still is connected to Peter Pan, so Peter Pan fans will sort of always go back to this movie. But if you haven't seen it or haven't seen it for a while, I highly recommend going back and rewatching it. It's not a Michael Clayton-esque sort of ethical thriller, but it is a nice kind of Sunday afternoon movie, and I think those are okay to exist too, and this one is a really effective one at doing that, and subtly brilliant in many ways. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you stay tuned to next week, where I'm going to be looking at the 2003 Oscars. So that's the Lord of the Rings Oscars. Which movie was forgotten there? Maybe you can guess in the comments down below. And let me know your thoughts. If you've seen Finding Neverland, do you like $1 Million Baby? We can talk about the other movies too. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time, stay tuned.